Mediation involves a third party with a non-binding resolution. That is, the parties mutually agree to go to a third party. So if you had two peers in a conflict, they would mutually agree that we're going to seek out a third party that would help them to voice their concerns and work through their conflict, so facilitate conflict management for them. But the resolution that they reached would not be binding. That is, it would be voluntary based on their desire to enact that resolution. Mediation is most commonly used in divorce settlements, and that's probably where you've heard it before, where a third-party mediator, oftentimes an attorney, but not always, but someone who's a certified mediator through the state in which they're practicing, would help to alleviate the burden on the social and on the criminals and the entire court system in order to make sure that they kept the case out of court. They actually facilitate for them a resolution, usually with the different parties' attorneys present, that would reach some sort of divorce settlement. And this is the most common type, but not the only type. There are a number of different kinds of mediations that go on. Mediations go on in the workplace, lots of times handled by human resource departments. Mediations go on in a lot of communities because there are mediation centers within the community. Nacogdoches doesn't have one per se that's official related to the community. However, a lot of communities do, and most of your larger communities have mediation centers, and they handle a lot of things like disputes between tenants in a housing complex, or landlord-tenant disputes, and those sorts of things. So, and even family conflicts. So it's not uncommon for someone to go to a third party to receive assistance. But that doesn't mean the third party who's mediating the conflict has the same outlook on the situation or philosophy toward the situation as another third party mediator would. So there's different ways to enact mediation. Classical mediation is results-oriented mediation. It's where you explain the game rules to the other person, you try to act very neutral, but you try to facilitate some sort of solution, and you have the other people sign that this is what they want for the resolution, and you try to do that as quickly as possible. Obviously, in classical mediation, we might have some problems with that as communicators and those coming from a communication perspective, because there's not much of a focus on the relationship and how you transform the relationship through the process. It's all results oriented. Additionally, in classical mediation, time oftentimes takes precedence over really hashing out the issues and getting to the actual incompatibilities and the attitudes that there's difficulties with. And in classical mediation, the mediator has a very neutral stance, so to speak, and if you perceive that one person is beating up on the other or getting the better end of the deal, then as the mediator, that's not your problem. It's, does everyone agree on the deal in the end? Which means that there can be quite an imbalance of power in the resolution that's reached, which can be sad. Social justice mediation is when you don't allow those power imbalances to happen, and in fact you try to restore power balance to the relationship of those that are undergoing mediation. A lot of people use social justice mediation when they are mediating between couples in which one of them has abused the other. Also, social justice mediation is used in cases where they feel like there are racial disparities or ethnic or economic disparities. And this is a common form of mediation. Transformative mediation, which has been made famous through the two books that have been written by Bush and Folger, focuses more on how you transform the relationship between the parties that are involved, not as much on the resolution in the end. You want to achieve both recognition and empowerment. Recognition is when the parties actually look at the other person, they listen to them, and they recognize where the other person is coming from and what their perspective is. Empowerment is when the parties learn how to resolve their own conflict. In transformative mediation, the mediator is very hands-off. And in fact, many times the mediator says very little during that mediation session. If you ever look at a transcript, which I have, of transformative mediation, it can seem like it's getting out of hand at times. And I'm thinking, these people are never going to talk to each other after this mediation session, after some of the stuff they've said. But actually, in terms of what we learned earlier about emotions, they're being able to express their emotions, and while it may seem like the conflict is escalating for a period, it helps them to describe their feelings and what they're going through, and in some cases, really be able to work through them, but not in all cases. Cloak and Goldsmith actually wrote a great book of narrative mediation that focused on storytelling and how stories that we tell are very meaningful, and they give insight into our own perceptions and interpretations of what's going on in our relationships, and that when we listen to one another's stories, we have the opportunity to write a new story in which it's not just your classical sort of story of where I'm the victim and you're the big bad wolf who's trying to eat me up and the world's out to get me, and I need someone to come in and save the day. And I'm using the Red Riding Hood story right now, so it's the hunter that comes in and saves the day. But you don't have to write that classical story. You can write your own story where you realize that you are probably a little bit both to blame as well as a little bit victim, and that where you can come in and save your own day, and it doesn't have to be someone else coming in and saving the day. And narrative mediation helps you work through those different stories. The problem is whoever tells their story first, that story usually is the most compelling and has more power over the mediator. So in narrative mediation, what they've done is lots of times they have two mediators, and one mediator will meet with one party and the other mediator will meet with the other party, and so they each hear the story of at least one of the people that are within the conflict, and so that when they come together, it's more even-handed, so to speak. There are informal mediations as well, and this is what we do informally for people, and you may have done this for your friends, family members, even coworkers. Kolb wrote an article that appeared in a book on hidden conflict about peacekeepers. And peacekeepers, in her research, she found that there were people that kept the peace in organizations by listening to different parties come to them with their conflict issues, and they acted more as listeners, but their role as peacekeeper and listener really had an impact on their own stress level and their own work productivity, and maybe even had some problems related to authority in the job place. And so that can be kind of tricky when you look at informal mediators in the workplace. But that is a really interesting chapter, though, that Kolb wrote, because it reminds us that third parties are sought out not just in formal channels. They're sought out in informal channels. And we go to different friends and our friend networks to help mediate our conflicts, or different family members to help mediate conflicts on a regular basis. And so you don't have to be necessarily an expert on conflict mediation in order to mediate a conflict. But at the same time, it may be that your mediator is not an expert, and that's why they're not being a very good mediator. So that can be problematic. Mediation and arbitration are different because arbitration, the solution and resolution, is binding that the third party asks you to reach, and this is usually in the court of law by a judge.